Welcome to All Right in Sin City, a podcast about writers and writing in the Windsor-Detroit region. Your podcasters today are
Irene Moore Davis, author, educator, and local historian.
Sarah Jarvis, former bookseller, publishing rep, and literary festival chair.
and me, Kim Conklin, Windsor-based writer and filmmaker.
Our featured guest today is Cecily Nicholson. Cecily Nicholson is the author of Triage and From the Poplars, which won the Dorothy Livesay BC Book Prize. Her most recent book, Wayside Sang, won a Governor General's Literary Award for Poetry. She volunteers with community impacted by carcerality and food insecurity. Her performances, talks, and residencies have been hosted by educational spaces such as New York University's Tisch School of the Arts, Center for Indigenous Research Creation at Queen's University, Woodland Pattern Book Centre, Milwaukee, and the Surrey School District. Cecily is currently the writer in residence for the University of Windsor. Welcome, Cecily.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, what brought you to poetry? Has it always been your main writing genre, or did you start with other styles of writing?
I started with poetry, actually more so song lyrics as a child. I've always loved language and I loved experimenting, but I was more interested in the lyric. I had a little brother, I still have a little brother who's a musician. And so my early years, it really was a relationship to poetry. But in my, as time has gone on, I do some prose writing and I do essay writing, but I'm always pulled back to poetry. I find that it has a way of, even when I'm not quite sure if I can form full sentences, I can always find a way through poetic language to express myself. And it kind of lends itself to a relationship to visual art and visual culture. I participate a lot in gallery environments and community, and it seems to connect sometimes too creatively. Apologies, I think just a little clanging of my husband making breakfast or lunch over there. So poetry has always been with me actually, and it still propels me.
So you mentioned that you're involved with the world of visual art. Do you work in visual art yourself? Do you actually do that?
I do. Yeah, I work in, and I would call what I do as maybe art services. I worked for a long time in the realm of the social services and transitioned a few years ago working in a neighborhood called the Downtown East Side in Vancouver. And I moved from working sort of frontline sort of women's services to working in a gallery. The gallery was a resource for people impacted by mental illness and other kinds of disabilities. So it was sort of this hybrid. And from that work, I've transitioned to working now with the city of Surrey, and I work for the Surrey Art Gallery. And what I coordinate there is mainly school programs, discursive and public programs, and other kinds of engagement. So I've made this really significant shift, actually, in my career. And all the while, yes, like in the backdrop, I'm a writer, but, in the front of it, I'm definitely more, an administrator and a programmer, and I work a lot with people, which is my joy. And so, yes, with visual art culture, but especially at the interface where it connects to people in their communities is my love. And, for wellness and for expression and so on.
So your poetry is something that you have that you're always ticking in the background and working on as well.
Yeah, and and I'm listening for it in others, but the literary arts is, it's part of a bigger spectrum of the arts for sure. So I do understand it as part of the contemporary art landscape. Sometimes as writers, maybe we think we pull apart or we think we're a little bit separate from that, but I do see these things as connected. And I think, just always being interested in language, it means like I just have that joy in my back pocket all the time, even as I'm doing, admin work as we all do in our different ways. And, it's always this pleasure or a lens basically in how I can look at life.
So your presentations are not just readings. They are indeed performances given with energy and intensity. How did that aspect of your artistic life develop?
Thanks, Irene. That's a compliment to hear. I think that one of the earlier things for me and influences for me is looking at oral cultures and cultures that work with language off the page. And I'm no expert at it. I'm definitely still in a learning curve at this late stage, but spoken word culture. So I grew up in the rural. I did not grow up in an urban center. I don't have an urban Black vernacular. I have a very rural, pastoral kind of upbringing. So it seemed, although I love spoken word and I love oral culture, I was trying to find a way to sort of balance those two kind of artistic forms, really. And I remember years ago, I was invited to open for an event for the wonderful writer, Lawrence Hill. And Larry Hill, as you may know, he's just this wonderful presence on the scene. Continues to be just such a wonderful, supportive person for other writers. So got to open for him, which I was, of course, terrified. And it was one of the largest crowds I've ever read for, even to date. There's like 300-400 people there to hear, And I was also a Black community, and we were gathering on the occasion in Chatham and thinking through the history of the Underground Railroad and connecting to that diasporic Black experience in the Canadian context. And so I thought, this is a pretty serious moment. I'm going to memorize what I'm going to say, and I'm going to speak off the page. And indeed I did, and it went okay. I think it went fine. But it was a beginning for me to think through performance and memorizing and actually speaking and connecting to an older history, growing up near the Stratford Festival and being very involved in theater as a kid, and really learning how to talk and to interact with people that way really brought me out of my shell, as it were. And so hearkening back to some of those experiences, being present, performing, trying to be, speaking with an audience, not just speaking to that page. And then the more I do that, the more I find that it's really rewarding. The ways in which audience come together in those moments is a little more intense in some ways. So I'm not sure if I answered the question, but just a gradual practice that I've been trying to grow, just to be able to be present.
In your biography, you mentioned that your volunteer work is involved with people who are impacted by the prison experience as well as food insecurity. Mm-hmm. There are several interpretations of the prison experience out there. Are you referring to those in physical prison or other examples of people who are trapped by circumstances?
Oh, I thank you. I really appreciate that question. So I actually physically have, for the last decade, worked with women in particular who have been incarcerated locally at the Fraser Valley Institute for Women. So I've just gone in with a group called Joint Effort. We coordinate arts and crafts workshops, reading groups, poetry workshops, anthologies, that kind of thing. So part of that is connecting generally to communities who are disproportionately impacted by the experience of policing and incarceration. And that is my communities. But part of it's also just seeing that extension of community and arts community as being relevant wherever we are. Of course, in the COVID climate, for all of our restrictions, our movements are restricted, and our capacity to go inside prison is not off the table. In this last year, I've been volunteering as a part of a place called Emma's Acres, which is a farm that in better times serves as a restorative justice place, a place where people on parole or temporary work order, different elements of recovery can participate, even if it's to come out for a few hours or an afternoon and return to jail. And in that time, they're learning relationships to land and agriculture and plants and growth, really good practices, as well as socializing in a safe environment, which is something that sometimes after a while people have to practice. So I've been participating in that space in the absence of prison labor because they're really struggling to keep going without that sort of community there. So it's the food security part is connected to that. The carcerality side is sort of this longer history. And my recent work is really thinking through those connections, working on a manuscript right now. And part of it, as I say, I grew up in a rural environment. I grew up on a farm that, first 15 years of my life, bused to a farm school. I was around farmers. That was my early life in southwestern Ontario, not far from where you all are. I guess if you're in Windsor, I don't know. So I really kind of shut that part of my life down for a long time. It's quite, when you first move to the city, come to Toronto, and it's like just trying to be urban or cool or whatever it was in my younger years. And now later, with some wisdom maybe and maturity anyways, I realized that was incredibly valuable experience, and that there's a lot of knowledge and peace and time that I was exposed to that is actually quite precious in the context of the city. So yeah, so communities that impacted by carcerality, right now being able to intersect with them on a farmland in the process of growing things together. And this will improve now that conditions are lifting a little bit and programs hopefully will return in the fall. But yeah, so that's a real world experience, not a metaphor. Yeah.
And so your work with food security, environment, so that's informing your work, your poetry coming forward?
Yeah, my forthcoming work is working through kind of an almanac sort of structure, which, if you're familiar with it, is kind of, some of it's silly and delightful, but some of it's attempting to document and relate to cycles of the tides or the moon and when to plant things and when's the best time and when it's going to be a drought. But that kind of relationship to the cycles of agriculture and rurality, I guess. So I'm trying to get to that. I'm trying to talk about what that's like within the context of Black diasporic experience, which is not something that is typically understood as well on the Canadian landscape, I think. And certainly in my experience, it always seems to be a bit of a surprise to people that there are Black people on farms, which of course, and we have a long rural and intellectual and art history that connects to that through dating back all the way through to the transatlantic slave trade and our arrival and intensive slave labor in the context of plantations through to now. There are these, indentured or seasonal workers, or there's a lot of movement of Black people in the context of agriculture. So I'm trying to touch on some of that, but in the meantime, also just the joy of working through now the metaphors of plants and plant life and ecology and the biome and just all the ways in which that allows us to maybe talk a little more softly and loosely about issues while still nurturing, what it is that we're focusing on and how we're talking about it.
Wonderful. I personally cannot wait to read this.
Okay, 2022. So it's coming out in the next almost a year from now. So thanks.
That's going to be amazing. So this has not been your first interaction with Windsor, this writer in residence gig, right? You've had a connection to the city before. How did you find us?
Well, I mean, you've got some great people there, as you may know. And so folks like Louis Cabri and Nicole, they are fixtures on the West Coast as well. And so I would say in terms of your poetic community, that was an early introduction for me. And of course, Louis knows lots of folks, and Common Ground Art Gallery, I hope I get the name right, has hosted me on 2 occasions, and both have just been phenomenal. The first time I visited, I had to return something the next morning, and I came back to the space and was surprised to discover there was a courthouse and a court case underway. And I was like, it's just the adaptation and the versatility of it I really quite respect. So I feel like there's lots of really important and interesting artistic and literature work happening in that context. I think a lot about that border. As you may know, in terms of my most recent book, I think through the history of my birth father, who I didn't know, but who moved across that border where you're near, also Buffalo, but was, somebody who migrated into Canada as a traveling worker and musician and, returned to the United States. But that border and that Windsor moment being, that antithesis to the Detroit moment. And the Detroit moment is something that I've spent a lot last 15, 20 years visiting. I spent quite a bit more time in Detroit than I have in Windsor. And, but also just, kind of fascinated that the 2 cities live as they do around the water with such differences and obviously some deep connections as well. So I would say that's mainly how I found you. I guess a couple of different routes there. But also just why I've returned. And I'm just so sad that I can't be there in person for this visit. That was part of what I was so excited to do because, as you know, like when you spend time in a place, you get to know it that much more. And, I had so many great conversations, my brief couple of visits there, that, the idea of being there for at least a month and just kind of getting a chance to have longer, more sustained conversations was really exciting to me. And I also really, really enjoy the students. So far, doing consultations as a part of the English department, the creative writing department, has been an absolute delight and I was very much looking forward to it. So yeah, all of that whole experience, I think, just rolled into one. And I think you're in a very fascinating, culturally significant city. Yeah.
We agree.
Yes. Good.
So speaking of your Windsor connections in the past, how did Wayside Sang come about? Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I think, it's not disconnected from what I was talking about in terms of trying to locate my Black experience in the context of my rural history. I was also trying to understand, my patrilineage, or, where did my Blackness, as it were, come from in vis-a-vis family. And having grown up in the rural experience, mainly in adoptive and foster care, not being raised by my birth family, I grew up very close to my younger Black brother, but we're not blood relations. And so just like really, at a point in time in my life where I have the capacity, the energy, the mental wellness to be able to pursue some of that history, as it were. And so, Wayside Sang, I set about to try to figure out a little bit about that family history, and then realized that I was as taken by the landscape and the possible histories of labor, and of course connecting to industry and to the car. And then following that metaphor started to just fascinate me as well. So thinking through the automobile, but also the industries that formed around it, and the infrastructure. So like the roadways and hospitality industries and so on. And so it just started to be a vehicle in and of itself to explore some of that personal archive, but also just to come to peace and to terms with where I'm at now as, being multiply displaced, but still actually being very grounded. And, I step away from that book feeling that I resolved some things for myself while I had a chance to really, really think through the actual land that I've traveled, by on foot, and certainly in many, many ways via car.
So given that it's kind of a challenging year for a writer in residency, a writing residency, what are your goals for this particular writing residency? And how do you think it might impact or inform your own work?
Well, so far it's, the goals. So I think, as I was saying, connecting with students and being a relevant presence for that and the environment that's hosting me. So that's the English department in creative writing. As much as possible, I'd like to connect to people there and be relevant to what they're working on. And that's a very satisfying goal for me, to be able to support, especially young writers. There's a lot of young folks, but also really seasoned folks as well, with these great practices, who just, really would like another, some dialogue with somebody different. And I really value that as well. So I would say at the heart of it is just a lot of really great conversations. And then being able to work on one's skill set as a critic, I guess, to do that gently and with care, but productively. And so I also want to contribute to people's practices and help, move them along, as we do in relationship, in mentorship, and in conversation. That's how we all grow. And so far it's been phenomenal, really just super thoughtful students, a ton of really great writing. So it's just kind of incredible. And and lots of mutual sort of overlapping interests and concerns as well, which is a surprise. And then the other goal, I suppose, is just to remind a broader literary world of the context of Windsor. And so, through my relations locally, to be able to do, this is the pro of the COVID era, is to be able to do a virtual event that, some of my compatriots from Vancouver, for example, could roll up and watch, which has happened in our most recent event. And so, and to have that overlap, like Fred Waugh visiting, how lovely is that? And chances are Fred Waugh would not have been able to visit if I was actually physically there in Windsor. This wouldn't have quite happened that way. So some of those goals about just connecting, not just locally, but to connect my local and my broader arts community, which is much bigger. It's more a North American context, to that focus on Windsor, and to remind people, I suppose, of this very important place to be in certain ways too. and the literary history of that, and the genealogy, I guess, of the writer in residence role over the years. And so like Margaret Kostakos or Nerbessi Phillips, or, like you've had some really, Daphne Martin, like really wonderful visitors over the years in this role. And so to be a part of that trajectory is not lost on me as well. I'm quite honored. Yeah, and then, at the end of it, after the intensive part of it, like when I'm done and I've left the residency, there will be some reflection, and there will be probably some productivity in my own work, because when you engage in dialogue and you work with people, and you can't help but work on yourself at the same time. So hopefully.
Okay, you've touched on a little bit of this in your conversation so far, and I wanted to dig deep into some of the themes you brought out in your work. So you reference Southwestern Ontario and Michigan, which is great for us because we are a cross-border entity. And a line from one of your poems addresses race relations in this region as well. If I can quote, "Every white relation, this neck of the woods, related to Ford the Motor Company." Mm-hmm. Elsewhere in the poetry, in your notes, you refer to the Black diaspora, as you mentioned, mm-hmm. and you also refer to the Caldwells, Sans land. And fortunately, they have now had some reparations and are working mm-hmm. with that as well. Mm-hmm. These references resonate for all of us here. Why was it so important for you to address these issues in this genre?
Oh my goodness, that's a big, you asked me a lot of detail there. So let me see if I can break it down. Just a quick answer to why this genre. I mean, it's just the genre that I am practicing in. It's the vehicle that I have to sort of follow through. I think I'm have a long practice and history of thinking through, organizing community-based work. I'm educated in political science and anthropology and sort of broader realms of systems, less so in English and creative writing. So this is partly how I see the world. I'm also thinking through an anti-colonial or a decolonizing perspective in relationship to land and my relationship to it and my movement on it. So touching down on Black diaspora, touching down necessarily throughout the book, thinking through the Indigenous lands that we all occupy. But in terms of let me start with that early question though, or the early reference around my white family, because and I really, you remind me that how much I appreciate reading in a Windsor context or this border context, because you do know the locales, you do know the references, whereas if I'm reading on the West Coast, quite often people do not, so they don't pick up on it. So I appreciate that. But yeah, I grew up and it was just a regular refrain, and this may be the case for all y'all families too, I don't know, but it was just this regular refrain about so-and-so uncle or such and such, there's always these references to so-and-so who worked for the Ford, or that time when Ford moved the car across the lake, and it was like some fantastic, pre-technology kind of moment around the relationship to transportation. But it was just a refrain that I grew up with. That was something I also write in this book about my Motorhead brothers' love. And this is part of my adopted family, still my family today. And they were like, I grew up around gearheads, like folks who are really deep into their cars. They're into the hoods. And I wasn't really, it was very gendered, I'd have to say. So my sister and I, for example, were not encouraged to participate in that as mechanics and such. But I had one brother went on to be an industrial mechanic, and they all they fix their cars still, and it astounds me. And they race cars and that kind of stuff. So it was a really big part of our upbringing, the relationship to car culture. And you're always a stone's throw away from those major companies in that conversation. So that's partly where that came from. But at the same time, trying to explain potentially to that white family as well, who I'm also in dialogue and conversation with, about the differences of my experience relative to that. So I have a different history, a different labor history, a different genealogy, a different path that I physically and historically, generationally have traveled. And so that was a newer conversation. But yeah, I'm just, Sarah, I'm trying to get back to the heart of your question. And I think you're sort of asking me about why in the context of poetry. Was that fair to say?
Yeah. How does it speak through your poetry? Yeah.
Yeah, I think again, trying to touch down with specificity in place and time, but at the same time, trying to remind us all, I don't want to say the romance of it, but the poetry of it anyway, but the poetics of it, what's beautiful, what flows, what is discernible in an art form to me, even as we're talking about, rusty, exhaust expelling things, that we're still talking about a kind of process and chemistry and beauty potentially, if we really, we want to understand it and respect it, because we do know the impact on the environment. And I begin this book with that notion of the fossil fuel psyche, because I have it. I grew up with this. It's very hard to understand things like freedom, even growing up, without understanding that in relationship to a vehicle. You didn't leave where I was from unless you had a vehicle. You needed a license or you needed somebody to drive you. Occasionally I did get very far on my bicycle, but there's limits. So yeah.
In Wayside Sang, there are lines that are broken and start on the right-hand margin and then expand for some sections and then chop again. How did you choose the meter and the form of your work?
Yeah, it's really quite dependent on the content of the work. Sometimes I am sounding it out, like I'm thinking I need, pause and respite or breaks in ways. Sometimes there's more than one voice, so I'm placing them in dialogue. Sometimes they overlap and they need to pull apart, something like that. So oftentimes if I'm using multiple margins, chances are I am introducing other voices, other than the narrator or other than what is obvious in the text maybe. But sometimes, as there's an intuition to it that's hard to put to words, around the ways in which poetry sometimes needs space, and you need to create breathing room, contemplation room on the page, and writing is the words, of course, and the letters and how we put those together in phrases and so on. But it is in poetry, it's also always the page. It's also the space itself is never irrelevant. And so, in this book, more than in previous work, I really do start to, because there's people who are so much more advanced in this, but I start to work with the page a little more robustly, I think, and try to create more spatiality and maybe a little bit more visual elements to how the work could be read.
You also have prose and poetic epigraphs for your sections from other writers. Were those prompts for your sections, or are they homage to another way of thinking?
That's great. You know what? I'm going to go with both, because those both make sense to me. Part of it, they are epigraph, but you'll note that I start with my own poetry and then I fold it in the second page. And I was trying to make my own categories. I really was trying to frame those for myself. But there's always a reference. There's always something we can fold in from somebody else. People are way ahead of us in different ways in terms of how they think about things. And I never want to just jump in and just assume that I'm coming up with anything original. And it doesn't make it good or bad to my mind, whether it's original or not. I think there's a quality to the work. But so yes, I wanted to be in conversation from that opening, and in a mutual way, hopefully letting that context inform me. But the work that I reference, and I include those references at the back, were really important texts to me. I read quite a lot, and I actually, most of what I read is science fiction, honestly. So it's not in there, but in terms of like essays and other writers and critical commentary and stuff like that, I do tend to read a lot of short form journalism, or long form journalism rather, and essays and stuff like that. I really enjoy those formats. And so I chose some select works because I think it's important for a reader to maybe read beyond me and consider other ways of thinking. So the infrastructure, referencing Deborah Cohen's work, for example. So that's an academic piece. We're probably, most poets are not going to pick that up, in our natural line of reading, I assume. It's an assumption. But hopefully now anybody that reads this book might be interested in her work, but also in spatial geography or in thinking through the role of infrastructure in a deliberate way. And these are, other fields of knowledge and such, but there's no reason why I think they can't be folded into poetry as well. So, yeah. But also, a last note on it is it's nice to have breaks in books. I think books, poetry does lend itself. Sometimes it's so good and you can just read page. one through to the end and it's so smooth. But sometimes, you know, you want just pockets of things so you can take a little, you know, pulse.
So, referring to those essays and things that you like to read, what's the idea that you're thinking about now that you haven't had a chance to tackle yet? What's kind of got your attention?
Well, I have a long list of reading to do around food sovereignty and security. I've collected a lot of resources and I've been slowly working my way through it. I'm also been trying to, and as it turns out, there's a fair bit of dense kind of scholarship on histories of African-American and Black Canadians' relationship, more so African-American relationships to agriculture and you know, histories and, you know, old history. So I'm trying to get to that a bit more deeply. I'm also working through the form of the almanac is an old form. It is an old, you know, document or publication. So the print history and sort of just exploring just the aesthetic of it, if you will. I'm not so deep into the meaning of it. I'm more like just really interested in the idea and the form of it. So that's something I'm spending some time with. And then just oral and verbal account, like, you know, talking to people, always my favorite thing. You know, you can't just turn that into research and you can't just turn that into poetry. It's an ethics to that. But I certainly love to mull ideas over with people and let them know why I'm mulling it over. I you know, share my projects in a transparent way and just thinking it through. And so, you know, the people that I work with and share, you know, outdoor safe distance space out at the farm that I mentioned, you know, these are some brilliant people who engaged in practices of biodiversity and, you know, abolitionist approach, you know, post having been in prison, like real perspective, you know, deep commitment to community. I learned from that. And so it's not overtly an extractive mode of like, you know, I'm making notes or something, but the spirit of it or the theme of it, you know, that community base is everything to me. That is the most important thing to me.
We'd love to hear some of your work. Would you like to read for our listeners?
Of course, yeah, shoot, where to start? I'm going to read from Wayside Sang because it seems, you know, the most relevant to where we are right now in the conversation. Low crude prices continue to take their toll, and we continue to live. As the gold price peaks foster ill opportunities for too many players in every sector, more drills out all year round declining, a turning point in dependency ratios. The gold seam drills its number, a steady increase, a finance sick shit ability to renew the lines, morph and misprice, contaminating groundwater, surfaces, wells, composite loss, trend, borders, tracks, trail, commodity, reports to war, population centers. In the rebar bared bones, the spalling infrastructure, tone of a place in an ongoing crisis of water. It's all of this or nothing. Fatigue, melts of semi-coherent poetry homes. Poetry homes may be a thing to do once there is a timeless day of pure concentration, to unpluck the neural machinery from the bone spurs, curling spine driven C-shaped. Matters of spine decompress, blowing past, inhalants, conduit particles, ultrafine particles. Where things were found, ourselves those days were stretched across a bond, with semi-trailer black with burgundy flame detail, all out. Every day felt to 2 cans of Coke and a Mickey of rye. Strings of substance we pull through black holes for homes. So long mold, the damp sprung. There was no controlling the heat or the bedbug flashbacks, the shared laundry and all the domestic tasks made public. We hit the road, hove time, discipline to muscle. We won't have to drive too far, just cross the border and into the city. And wherever the final destination takes this, it will be higher ground. A waiting trench, the front across the dash, a deep open road, and through the window on the glass are bouquet crystals of settlement that stream past, mirror side, appear larger. I'm so sorry, very loud airplane going by. Streaming past mirror side appear larger, the myth of the colonial, and the bluff of ever present. But after all, the lakes hold ashes and fur, and the long route tapers to a blue strip August, the walk along here on a highway. I was a daughter once, on the route that she shines on, leaning into the path is nettle, heavy with rain. There are times that a car bends perspective in its motion, making room, measurable extents, some kind of care, comfortable enough front seat, shelter, capacious hearts that attend to traumas. There are times startled by the good of nature, and the windows roll down, cause a pressure drop. Oh, pressure. Let the sun in, and that whistle of cold air. I'm just going to read a little bit further on in the book. Lakeshore onto Buxton. The Great Lakes' deep sense of time, studded with isles, a basin, river to sea, stable shoreline fretwork, mangrove root system staves erosion. And we became here on this edge, listening to spotless mother plates giving songs, singing, "Hey baby, it's your time now." Ready, the music shores up, banks, risen, chorusing, hours, once again, ready to move. Waysides, destinations, way stations, a performance. Hotels with bars that spill out into parades and fests in the street, festival stayed, expenses fray by fray, with the future. At rest, stop, monument to sacred erratics. A storm came through, mustard flowers and green brassica oilseed, genetics grown wild along roadsides, escaped fields to ditches through schoolyards and parks, plants plowed back into the soil come back to me as the way dives by dry lakes, 150 miles to the next gas station, 60 miles to the next church. Bound to foothills, I've come to the Rockies, the Bluebird Motel, paradise on the prairies, taking the long way atop the ripple and buckle shift, torn buckle crust carved surface. Like core bleeding volcanoes, the black top amplifies heat. Durational is visible at night. All the roads come through beats of fibrous hearts, a lace of navigable tracks, a spatial syntax that is legible from space. Unknown years on the road, apart, movement, wheels, will. Rest is in the distance, while passing motels given over to early breakfast, breaks in the 4, 5s, and 6s, washing hair in the truck stop, in the decent bathroom sink, a fair moment smoking out under a sweet knot of trees, still standing despite manifold exhaust rolling, fevers, stretched, songs alongside.
Cecily Nicholson, thank you so much for sharing your time and talent with us today.
Oh my goodness, thank you so much for having me and for your patience. Yeah, really appreciate it. Questions were great.
We hope to see you back in Windsor when things are better.
I will send you a note when I come through next time for sure. That would be lovely. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us. Look for more episodes of All Right in Sin City wherever you listen to podcasts, or check out our website, allrightinsincity.com. For information and announcements of new podcasts, sign up to our email list or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.